Today and Thursday we're going to talk about attention. So attention, as I told you before, attention and memory are probably the most important topics in cognition for many reasons. First of all, because probably is the largest corpus of research of people dealing with that. And second of all, because in a different way, both attention and perception are extremely present. Sometimes behind the scenes, sometimes on top of anything else within the entire field of cognition and perception as well. So memory, for all the good reasons, memory is intuitively we understand why memory is so important, because we cannot dissociate, we cannot understand anything about ourselves or other people or behavior, even in animals, in anything, without somehow relating or assuming things about memory. Attention, on the other hand, is a problem, because attention, we don't understand. There is a big conundrum about what is attention and the definitions of attention. And many people, including myself, would say that the narrative, the discourse in the field ends up using the idea, the entity of attention in a, sorry for the word, metaphysical way, in a way that sometimes restrains us more than explains things to us. Now, my original plan was to invest an entire lecture, maybe even more than one, to talk only about that. But because of what happened, we don't have time. And if I manage, I will record an additional complementary lecture about it, YouTube, a continuation of those introduction lectures. Let's see. But now I'll just sorry. I'll just tell you about one way that memory, not attention, enters anything regarding perception and cognition, including attention. Now, you are already understanding that memory can be artificially explained or defined: short-term memory, working memory, long-term memory. So in our most people, if you ask memory, we think about our ability to recall events from the past or information from the past that is not currently available. But obviously, and now you are learning, we have short-term memory, we have memory that determines behavior in a way that we don't have access to it. We are unconsciously using. Okay. So when we go closer and closer to the short periods of time, would you agree with me that probably the most conservative definition of memory is the use of any information that is not now presently being presented? which means, first of all, what is present? There is no present. Anything is already past. This moment is already past, right? Okay, but let's not go to the philosophy part of it. But all the research, everything we do, all the tasks, all the experiments, all the manipulations that we do in cognition, they involve some kind of change. Let's be more careful. Everything concerning attention, visual attention, involves change. Either you detect something, well, not everything, but let's say at least all the paradigms that I presented last time, the Stroop, the global local, well, that doesn't involve, but the flanker, any movement, the manipulations of attentional shift, they all involve change. Change automatically implies a comparison between something now and something that was before. Change is must be a long time, even if it's a second, right? So whenever something changes in a paradigm or in a task, whenever something changes on the screen and the participant react, it means, if the change was perceived, it means that the system compared past to present. Must be. Even if it was a second ago, it means that memory was involved. Now, this is a long story, and the confound between paradigms that are called attention or perception and memory, whether we confound, meaning whether we are assessing memory processes instead of other processes that we think we are, is everywhere, is all the time. Let's go back to attention. Let's continue with attention. So most of the research on attention is visual attention because we tend to think that vision is our most important sense. It's probably also the most practical, technically practical sense to manipulate, to test. But most of the higher order, the macro theoretical theories about vision, they are relevant for other senses, mainly hearing as well. All right. Now, research on attention, and that's probably relevant for any field, goes like this. There are those that try to define, to anchor, to understand the basic definitions of the mechanisms of visual attention. How it works, what are the processes, those are the big theories. Then this is, let's say, the inner circle of the field of visual attention. Then the second circle would be all those researchers, all those subfields of attention that use the most basic definitions and paradigms and effects, and they use either to better define things within the field or to discover new things. Let's say exogenous attention, endogenous attention, or manipulations of covered and overt attention shift. They tend to ask whether those basic principles, how they interact with perception and other processes around the field. So that would be the second. And then the biggest field, the largest circle, would be those that assume everything that the field of attention, the theories, the accepted, the canonical theories of attention propose, and they use it for other things. So in social psychology, in person, in emotion, everything you can imagine, they use this myriad of different fields. They use manipulations and theories and hypotheses from the field of attention. They assume it as is, and then they check whatever they want to check from another field. Okay. So, in the field of visual attention, let's move. The chunk, the inner, what I call the inner circle goes like this. During probably from the 50s until the 90s, there was a big discussion about the basic processes of attention. Things were more or less agreed upon, and since then we have been assuming, we have been adopting the theories from the 19th on. The biggest theory in the field nowadays, in the last 20 years, maybe more, probably the theory that has the largest number of papers that involves is the perceptual theory, which was proposed in the 90s and has been used for everything outside attention. If you ask researchers in attention, in the field of attention, those in the inner circle, nobody likes this theory. Nobody agrees, nobody accepts this theory. On the other hand, the psychology, all the fields in psychology use it. Okay, we'll get there. So that's the main focus of our lecture today. Attention, probably the biggest inner definition, theoretical definition of attention as a function, uses the word selection. How do we select the information that is pertinent and don't spend resources on what is impertinent? There are huge problems with that definition. What is pertinent, what is relevant, what is irrelevant. So many times, the definition of relevant is a hindsight definition. Like when we see what was used, we say, this was the relevant information. And at least half of the times, there is no theoretical criterion to decide up front what is relevant and what is not. But still, it's accepted that attention is a function that tries to select information from what must be used, or etc. So and the word filter is everywhere. We talked about the main paradigms, the Stroop, the flanker, global local, and Simon. Stroop and flanker are the biggest ones. And all these paradigms, effects, and theoretical interpretations, they adopt partially or fully the response competition hypothesis, which is motor by definition. So let's review it. So I'll come back to this soon. Within the field, what I said before, from the 50s to the 90s, the debate between early and late selection debate boils up down. The main story is when it happens, when the filter is employed, when during the process, from the moment that stimuli enters until the moment that there is a response, the entire when the filter, this selection takes place, makes its things, whether early or late. We'll come back to this soon. One important note, all those classic definitions from the book, not only from the book, regarding overt attention, covert attention, exogenous and endogenous attention, they are irrelevant. All of those regard attentional shift, when you move the focus of attention from one place to the other. So overt would be when you move your eyes, when you put your fovea wherever the focus of attention is. Covert is without moving your eyes. Exogenous is when stimuli predict the shift of the attention. There is a big problem with the definition of what is exogenous attention. I hope I'll get to this. And endogenous would be when the system decides. It can be consciously. I decide while I am looking here, I'm paying attention to this side. Or unconsciously, a prime or a stimulus sends my attention, my focus of attention somewhere else. So let's review the flanker task. I told you, so we have two alternative targets in the center of the screen, flanked by two distractors. Incongruent distractors are those that the incongruent displays, trials, are those in which the distractor is the alternative target. The identity of the distractors, they are associated with the wrong motor response. Stop me if it's not clear. Yes, I'll try to look at the chat all the time. And what we usually see, it's a very strong effect, that reaction time for incongruent displays is slower than for neutral displays. This is the interference part, if you remember. Usually we don't see facilitation effects in the flanker task. Facilitation is between congruent displays and neutral displays, when the distractors and the target have the same identity. The other part of the flanker interference effect, one is reaction time, the other is accuracy. So we have more errors for incongruent displays than for neutral displays. Okay, I told you that all the main theories and interpretations have reached the conclusion that the problem is in the selection of the central target and the inability to ignore the flanking distractors, or to suppress the locations, the stimuli on those locations. So the problem, even though In all those displays, in all trials, in all conditions of the flanker task, the geographical configuration is identical, and it's optimal because nothing moves. The gaze is, the target is on the center, always at the same place, where the fovea is fixed. So, and the distractors, they always appear exactly in the same place, in the flank. And even though these are the best possible circumstances, our system cannot not process the distractors. All right, so we have spatial selection failure, which is equal for all displays, which means that the information from the distractors, the information accumulated from the distractors, is the same. It doesn't matter which distractor was presented, right? And the target the same. So the system, because it fails or it doesn't, the system accumulates information from all the displays in the same way, at least in the first part, or no, during the entire process. They accumulate because the system cannot suppress the distractor positions, so the accumulation of the information is identical. And the time course of this accumulation should be identical too. So the assumption, the conclusion, the assumption of all the different theories for the last 50, 60 years, oh, sorry about this, is that our system cannot, for some structural reason, filter out distractors when all the stimuli are presented in a very small area. So usually it's accepted that when the area is smaller than 3 degrees of visual field, the system cannot pry into it and select only one part and disregard another part. Do you all understand what it means 3 degrees of visual angle? Is there anyone that doesn't know? Okay. I will do, okay. So visual angle is the best way to define the size of stimuli on the screen. I will do for the next, or maybe a complementary, I'll do a short review of a few minutes to explain what is degrees of vision, why is it used. It's simple, and you will find everywhere in the papers that you read, and possibly depending on the manipulations you're employing in your EDM, in your methods, maybe you will have to also describe the sizes of the stimuli, and then you will use degrees of freedom. So I'll remind myself that, okay. So what it means is that when it's too small, smaller than something, let's say the distance between extended hand would be something this size. Okay, when it's smaller than this size, our system cannot zoom in that much. The second assumption, adopted interpretation, is that the difference in time and in accuracy between the incongruent and congruent and neutral displays is a result of post-perceptual processes. So, according to the response competition hypothesis, as I said, that is an umbrella explanation for all those paradigms, all those effects. In incongruent displays, we have the incongruent, the congruent, the target identity activates the entire system until it activates the correct motor response, and the incongruent distractors, because their identity is part of the response set, the target set, they activate at the same time the incorrect motor response. In neutral displays, the neutral distractors, they are processed exactly. Those guys were processed incongruent, but they do not activate any motor response. So there is no competition. And the assumption is that once there is a competition, two hands are activated at the same time, a higher level decision-making system entity has to decide which hand will be allowed to press the button, and this consumes additional processing time, and that is the flanker effect. Now, we already know that the problem is that we only have RT, we only have 2 points between to connect. We have the stimuli we presented to our participants, and we have reaction time and accuracy collected. We don't have anything in the middle. How do we know that this is a result of here, but not something that happened here? So I told you that during the 80s, 90s, there was a big series of researchers from different people, very, very respected researchers in the field, including Erik Erikson, which is the original, the first author, the person that invented the flanker paradigm. And the flanker paradigm, meaning including the manipulations, the interpretations, the methodology, the analysis. By the way, the first most important pair was Erikson and Erikson 74. It was Erik Erikson and Barbara Erikson. They were a couple. They passed away already. So there was a big chunk of of important papers, researchers, of important people that they used electrophysiological measurements independent of one another, each one in itself problematic because the electrophysiological measurements are indirect. We measure electricity, we measure waves in the brain that we assume. We have a chain of assumptions, methodological assumptions for each one of them, that we assume that it reflects something that we want. But when we use many together, even though each one of them is not strong as RT and accuracy, which are direct behavioral measurements, which are agreed upon, everybody agrees what RT reflects more or less. It reflects a delay, reflects interference, it reflects a problem. P300 is ERP, is like EEG, electroencephalogram. So it's that cap with all the electrodes in the brain. And during the time that the participant is answering, many things are happening in the brain. Endless different waves, different frequencies are happening at the same time outside the task all the time. Our brain doesn't stop for a minute, we know that. But after many hundreds, thousands even of experiments and convergent research, the field agrees that the P100, which is a peak in a specific frequency, a peak wave in a specific frequency that happens in the brain after 300 milliseconds, That's why p100. We have n negative when it goes down and p when it goes up. It's the opposite, but doesn't matter. 300 is the time in milliseconds after the stimulus was. So every time that something, we know p100, okay, LRP, it's another one, it's a preparation of a response that happens afterward, and EMG is the best one, is electromyogram. It's an electrode on every muscle, and it can see when the muscle starts to activate, even much before movement. So if it moves, you really can see it, but even a preparation, when even before the participant can feel or realize or even think about any movement, the muscles are already preparing, and we see it on EMG. All these measurements have an extremely high resolution in time. They are very good in, because we can pry into microseconds even, which we don't need for research in perception and cognition. We usually work in the area of milliseconds. Seconds are already too slow. fMRI, this is one of the problems with fMRI, with magnets, is that they assess processes, the both reaction in the blood, oxygen doesn't matter, but the time resolution is very slow for perceptual or cognitive processes. Okay, so they tested independent, they used independent measurements to check whether what we think that we know about the p100, the LRP, and the EMG, they are congruent. They make sense in terms of the response competition hypothesis, the theoretical story that they offered. If so, we should see a correlation between the competition that a certain display elicited, a competition between two alternative simultaneously activated responses, and the RT delay. And this can be checked trial by trial. So maybe one incongruent display, one trial out of 300 trials for one participant, one trial can already tell us, which means that if we can check trial by trial, we can have a very strong statistical power for these measurements, for these assessments. If we see in one specific, a correlation trial by trial between the activation of the wrong response and the amount of delay, then it gives us a strong, it doesn't prove anything, obviously. It can be many other things, but at least it doesn't rule out that possibility. If they haven't seen this correlation, we would have to rule out the response competition hypothesis. So they observed strong correlations between the activations of the wrong response and the amount of time that took until the factor response was made. Okay. Do you understand why this doesn't prove? It only supports. And the only possibility, the only final, the only conclusive result would be if they couldn't find it, or if they found a negative correlation that we would rule out, but it doesn't prove. Okay. Since then, the response the hypothesis, because, and now it's the sociology of science, which today is staring, because these were very important people and very important because they best researchers, strong researchers, beautiful papers, very well written. Because there was this wave, since then nobody checked the response competition hypothesis for, I don't know, 20, 25 years. It became very few. We won't have time, but never mind. It's accepted that this is an umbrella explanation for all these paradigms and effects in the field of attention. What remains is the question why the system, the attentional filter, the attentional mechanisms cannot visually select the target and suppress or not process the distractors in a typical flanker task. Why we have visual a failure of visual selection? All right. Early selection theories. So as I told you, between the 50s and the 90s, early selectionists against late selectionists. Early selection, the big assumption is that we have limited perceptual resources. What does it mean, limited? It must involve time. So we have unlimited resources. If you are given unlimited time, you can process and perceive anything in your visual field. But given given a short period of time, the presentation, the immediate presentation of the stimuli in the flanker task, the resources you immediately have to identify the target, they are crude, they're coarse. So in order for the system, that's the early selection main story, in order for the system to be able to identify the identity of a stimulus, whether it's an X or a Z or which one of the alternative targets from the target set, the system has to draft all the available resources, which are limited, concentrate them upon the target, and only then the system can identify it, either because it needs more resolution or because the system needs to start comparing the stimulus presented at the moment to memory, to the stored set of alternative targets. So many inner mechanisms have been proposed. Probably the most important name would be Donald Broadbent, who wrote so much in the field. You recognized Danny Kahneman, who, by the way, taught my PhD supervisor. So in academic lingo, Danny Kahneman is my grandfather. Anne Treisman was his wife. She passed away. Kahneman and Tversky, they got the Nobel Prize for economy. Never mind. So early selection theory. So many inner mechanisms were suggested. Either we do pigeonholing, meaning that we cover things that we don't need, and we let only the important information enter the system, or categorizing, chunking them feature-wise, identity semantically wise, or location-wise. And only then, after the filter stepped in and did and concentrated the resources, we can continue to identify and then reach the right decision for the response. Why two corollary explanations would be leakage and slippage, meaning that if the filter is a colander, let's say, so the holes are too big, so the distractors they pass through the filter. That would be leakage. The system is doesn't have the resolution for this kind of stimuli. Slippage would be that the resources that the attentional system concentrated on that area, the time that takes to process everything, they slip, they fall, and whatever is close by the target, those slipped resources end up processing. So all of those are failures of the system. So area, okay, so one of the metaphors used during many years is still used, it has problems, is that our attentional focus is like a spotlight. We can open it and disperse the resources, and as early selection suggests, we can focus it in a very small concentrated beam of light with where we have more power, more processing power. Okay. Leakage and slippage, they are more or less the same, and chunking would be like it's a Gestalt based idea that we are so used to read words that we cannot parse out most participants. They are people that read a lot. So whenever they see three letters, even if they have no semantic meaning, they cannot parse out, they cannot see three objects, they automatically see one object if they are close together. Even if it's not letters, we chunk together. All right. Late selection assumes that our perceptual capacity, our perceptual resources, they are not that critically limited. And we can perceive, we can collect high resolution information from everything that appears. And attentional mechanisms, they operate much later, after we already collected. Inside our system, we don't have to continue to accumulate together to collect information. Inside our system, within it connects with memory entities, and only then attentional mechanisms decide, filter the important, the pertinent information in order to reach the correct response. Which means that as long as the stimuli are presented, the system continues to gather information, high resolution information. I'll jump, we don't have time. Contingent capture theory is an important one from the late 90s, from Tevis, from Holland. The main idea of the contingent capture is that the distractor, the target set, influences, directs our perceptual system, meaning that if we are looking for, if the two targets in the task is X and Y, the basic perceptual process are already attuned to Xness and Y-ness. So anything that looks like an X will be prioritized. The perceptual thing will process more of those, of anything that resembles an X and a Y on the account of other stimuli. So this is heavily memory induced, determined. So let's say that here in this specific manipulation of the flanker task, the two targets are either this slanted line or this slanted line, right? This or this. So those lines here, they are part of the target of the prioritized family of things or of stimuli. Uh, so they are processed much more than curved lines, which are not. So if we had a neutral distractor that resembles this, they would also be more processed and would probably uh, interfere with responses much more. One manipulation, for instance, is that if the target would be like randomly either red or blue, if one of those neutral distractors appear in red or blue, they will also be processed more than if they appear on black. We have, how long do we have? We have 20 minutes, all right. Perceptual theory. It began, it was suggested, it was proposed in 1995 by Nili Lavi, also from Tel Aviv University. She, after her PhD, she became a professor in the City College of London. I think so, yeah. And she's one of the biggest names in the field of attention, of visual attention, for sure. And let me just show you, for instance, where are we? Look, if you put Nili Lavi on Google Scholar, her first paper, the original paper, has 2,381 citations. For in the field of attention, that's a lot. That's really a lot. That's crazy numbers. From 2005, this is a famous one. Also, trends. It's an important paper. This is a superficial, not in a bad way, a review of all the perceptual load ideas and evidence. Yet, as I told you before, if you ask researchers in the field, everybody, all of them will say, no, yeah, nobody nowadays, I don't know if accepts is the right word, but yes. So it's mainly used, all those all those citations are people in different fields using the perceptual theory as an assumption. And why? Because it's elegant, it's nice, it's a very good narrative, it's a good story. And let's see how much time we have today. If not, I'll continue next time. I want you to understand what are the problems with this narrative. Okay, so the perceptual theory is a hybrid theory between early and late selection. It starts, think about it, after 30 years of the big guns fighting. No, it's early selection, it's late selection. So early selection, so much evidence based on it. The fact that we can only hear, if dichotic listening, you give two messages, each one in one ear. This was probably the first important base of evidence. If you give only two separate information, each one in one ear, you can only process one of them. Late selection, the cocktail party effect. You are listening to the conversation with the three people around you, a lot of noise around, and you're really concentrated and you're following and you participate in a conversation in front of you, in a conversation behind you that you even didn't know it's been conducted. Suddenly someone says your name, you jump. You don't know, you don't know what they were talking about, but suddenly your name, and then you jump, meaning that something behind your consciousness, something behind the system has been listening to all the conversations around. And once your name jumped, this system captured, stopped you, moved your head. Okay, so this would be late selection. So the perceptual theory came and said, no, there exist both early and late selection. They both can occur. Our system is not either. And what determines whether it will be, if the information will be filtered early or late, is the demands of the task. If we have a difficult task, then the task itself will use all, I'm talking about this part here, will use all the available resources. And there will remain no spare unused resources. If the task is very easy, then there will be processing resources, perceptual, I don't know, resources that will remain unused. And those resources, they walk around and they start processing whatever they find on the way, and then you end up processing things that you don't need. So when you have a demanding task, you end up, the system ends up applying early selection. And when it's an easy task, it's late selection. The assumption here, let's say the cocktail party effect, the assumption is that to follow a conversation in a noisy place, in a cocktail party, you don't need too many resources. So according to the perceptual theory, the cocktail party effect occurs because you have resources unused and they have nothing to do. They start to listen to the other conversation. Sorry for I'm making half of a joke of that. It's not out of disrespect for Neely, but it's funny. Because the assumption is that for every task, we have a minimal amount of resources that we must exhaust, that we have to burn. We cannot not use this minimal amount of resources. That's a problem. That's a problem. Now, this critical assumption, what I just said, is not written anywhere. Mm, is not written in none of the perceptual law theory mess. It's a logical derivation of the perceptual law theory. Because, okay, you know what? Let's go back to, let me explain exactly how yes, it's Neely, mainly these first papers, how it was operationalized. So easy tasks, as I just said.
My stomach hurts, so no, but I can't take this to buy it. Actually, I'm gonna give these to homeless.
Maya. Okay.
Sorry.
It's okay. Easy tasks. So easy tasks are, in the terminology of the perceptual law theory, is low load. So the task demands not too much. It imposes a low processing load on the participant. And difficult tasks, they impose a high perceptual cognitive load. Ooh, it gets complicated because, okay, I'll stop. We want later on, people started to find problems in replicating those experiments, and they found holes in the system, and then the problem began because the perceptual theory started to patch holes and problems, and suddenly load had to be separated in cognitive load, memory load, perceptual load, and that the original is perceptual load. But then cognitive load is the opposite of perceptual load, and memory load is also the opposite. So in the end, it became like a Frankenstein. Sorry, again, I'm saying without disrespect. The way I'm describing is on behalf of all of those that have criticism about it, which includes me. That suddenly it became a Frankenstein of anything, any effect that doesn't really work with the original perceptual load narrative can be explained by changing the adjective of the load. And then at a certain moment, after 10, 15 years, researchers in the field started to feeling uncomfortable. Okay, so let me show how, and this is the first work was, it's not surprising that it was so well accepted. It's very elegant, it's very convincing. Look what she did. So she presented, she used the flanker paradigm. So this is a load display. This is from the original paper from 95. So the target is either an X or a Z, and the target appears randomly somewhere along the center row of the display. And the distractor one distractor appears somewhere around, randomly around the target, between, like from trial to trial, the distractor appears in a different position around the target. So we could have congruent distractors, Z and Z, X and X. Incongruent, the distractor is an X, but the response, the target is a Z, the same here. And neutral ones when the distractor identity is unassociated with neither response. All right. The high-low displays, she embedded the target within a string of neutral letters. Okay, so each trial, each display, you have to the participant had to search, had to find the target within this long string of letters, while the distractor remains the same like in the low load display. So her comparison is the distractors are exactly the same between the high load condition and the low load condition. The only difference is that here the target appears easily and immediately, and here the target must be found. So there is a small search here. Makes sense, right? So, according to the perceptual theory, in the low load displays, because the target can be found easily and promptly, there are surplus resources, and then those resources that must be burned, must be used within this task, they end up walking around. The only thing they can process is the distractor, and that's why the distractor is processed. Here, the load imposed on the participant to find the target consumes all the available resources, and there is nothing left for the distractor to be processed. This is from her original paper. These are and nowadays it doesn't happen anymore, although there is no problem, but there is no picture. There are only tables. There is no graph, I mean. So here what we see, the important part is this. So this is the task load, low condition, high condition. This is reaction time, the mean reaction time. And this is the difference between incongruent and neutral. And we can see that the difference in milliseconds between the incongruent and the neutral, that is the interference in the low condition, which is this, is 40 milliseconds, which is highly significant. And in the high condition, the difference between incongruent and neutral is 4 milliseconds, which is statistically insignificant. The problems, wait, before the problems. Neely explained that perceptual load, the load that the task imposes, plays a causal role. It's the main thing. That's the thing that determines whether it will be early selection or late selection. This is a quotation for 95. This is a very compromising and very courageous and very firm assertion. The proposal that a theoretical suggested entity or mechanisms plays a causal role, well, you seldom see it written. Researchers, scientists are usually a little bit more careful to use such a strong word. But she did. She is a very strong person. And the main prediction is that we will always see a negative correlation between the load imposed, measured, operationalized, reflected by reaction time and accuracy, and selection efficiency. Selection efficiency is a derivation of reaction time, right? Is the difference in reaction time between the conditions. And the hypothesis is that distractors are processed in the low load in terms of the temporal locus of attention operation, early or late, that that the load will define, meaning that the distractors are processed only after the target has been processed, because they are processed only in the low load condition, and they are processed by surpluses. Surpluses can only exist after the main part was used, right? So those resources that processed the distractor, they became available only after the target was processed. So distractors were processed after the target was processed and identified. And identified, why? Because only after target identification there is surplus. Otherwise, if it was only localization of the target, like early selection would say, that in order to identify we need more resources, then the system would continue to invest the resources in the target. There would be no surplus, or the surplus can only occur after target identification, right? It's obvious, I'm repeating myself. Okay. We will continue with the problems next time. Questions. Anyone? Maya, now you can use your...
I actually have a question. I'm not sure I understand really why we must like exhaust like all the processing resources, like if there's not a lot in the critical assumption, like for example, like with distraction, and like in the textbook when they were talking about distraction, here you kind of choose to like not process like everything. So how come with here in critical assumption, like you don't have like cognitive choice? You just like you don't even realize and you have to process more information.
Well, probably all the important names in the field of attention would jump in joy by your question. That's the problem. Where does it come from? How can it be? First of all, where does it come from? Nobody in the history of since Plato, nobody talked minimum amount of resources. How can we define it? Is it per time? Is it per task? That's what's the suggestion. It cannot be per time because actually it determines time, determines reaction. So it's per task. How can we anchor that on anyone? And where does it doesn't, it's not connected to any other idea, any other even intuition. Your intuition jumped exactly in the right place. What does it mean, minimum amount, and why it must be exhausted? How can we operationalize this idea? How can we even check that hypothesis? This is I think this is the biggest theoretical problem with the perceptual theory. There are others that we'll cover next time, but perfect question. Who else? I will take 5 minutes and then I'll come back. So it will be my office hours. Okay, in the next hour I'll be in my office hours. So I'll take 5 minutes and then I'll come back. All right. See you soon.
Thank you, Professor.
Sure. Thank you.